Hello, everybody. So this is my bold part to explain to you some of my research, how our body can enhance second language learning. How everything began. It was 1990 at the Johannes Kepler University that I started teaching Italian. And in those days, like nowadays, we used listening comprehension activities, which you might know. So you listen and you have to fill in gaps. And as you might know, first time it's interesting, but then it kills you. Why is it so? Good question. The thing is that second language learning has been influenced always by philosophy and linguistics. One guy you have to know, because it ruined probably your second language learning experience, is René Descartes. Les Discours de la Méthode, 1637. He said, body and mind are separated. So this is the reason why you sit all the time when you learn a language, and you are not allowed to move. And your body is only the container for your organs. It has nothing to do with your mind. Next guy, you should make responsible for all the art you had when you learned your languages is Noam Chomsky, the most influential linguist in our age. And he also ruined part of my, part of my instruction when I studied linguistics. So I had to appreciate all his writings, so I know what I'm talking about. And he said that language is an abstract phenomenon of the mind, and that words are symbols for objects and events in the real world. So he also continued this line of separation between your body and your mind. So, my way. One nice day, I had enough of boring my students. So I pantomimed words. That was not new. But what I did as a new component of my lessons was that I asked the students to also pantomime with me. So make with me monkey, or this is hi, and it's me, and you, and where. And they all were asked to do it. And they all laughed, of course, like you would laugh, and they said, she must be mad. But then we observed. We didn't know what we were doing. I just wanted not to bore them. And then we observed that the words had already been retained. They didn't need to learn them at home. So, why? Why is it so? Why? I didn't know. There was no theory on that in those days. I'm talking about 30 years ago, right? So, why did my students retain the words only by performing gestures? And looking for literature, I found the book that changed my life. The Structure of Long-Term Memory by Wolfgang Klimisch. He is a very well-known memory scientist. In those days, he was professor at the University of Salzburg, sorry. He was at the Department of Psychology, Cognitive Psychology. And I read this book, and the theory, his theory in those days, but this was already a theory in the 80s. He says a word is a network consisting of different components. In those days, he could not prove it in brain terms, because in those days, he didn't have brain imaging at his disposal. So you might imagine the network like this. You've got all the components, for instance, for a word like orange, right? So you have a little network which codes for the shape of the orange, for the color. So you've got, let's say, a visual little network connected with the smell of the orange. So you have an olfactory network, and you have a gustative network because you taste the orange. So altogether, when you learn a word, according to Klimisch, you construct a network connecting all the information you collect while learning the words, and learning to know also the fruit. So a word, according to Klimesh, this was a cognitive psychology theory, a word is a network consisting of different components. And complex networks store information better in a more complex way, and this information decays less fast. So you might know that when you learn a list of words, and you have learned it, and then you don't repeat it for, let's say, 2 weeks, then you have probably 20% of the words missing, if not more, depending on your age, right? So, and the more complex the information is that you acquire, and this was to me new, because we thought of economic information. So the little information you have, the better it is for your learning. No, the more you learn, the more complex it is, the better you store it. That was Klimesh. After many years, somebody else told me, and this was Friedemann Pulvermüller, words are experience-related networks in the brain. And Friedemann could plot this idea on a real brain with lots of experiments he performed, and he still performs, so that you will have a region coding for the smell, which you will see, it's the orange, light orange dot, a region for the taste, which is the gustatory area, the insula in the brain, and what you hear and what you speak, they are all networks. And if you grasp the orange and if you squeeze it, then you will also have motor programs in your motor cortex, which is a strip going from one ear to the other. And all these information pieces come together and make a big network in your brain. So what Klimesh said as a cognitive, as a theory in cognitive psychology was then proven in cognitive neuroscience. So I had to prove something too, because I observed my students, and my students were happy with that, and I was happy with them. But the institution didn't like my madness, because they thought, what is she doing? She's making 30, 40 people jump in the lecture room. What are they doing? Is that kind of, weird way of teaching? And as there was no theory behind that, I was somebody doing crazy things. So I had to prove that my students really retained the information better by making gestures instead of only hearing and reading the words. And I made a PhD with Wolfgang Klimesh, of course, and I had to invent, kind of invent a language, an artificial corpus. It sounds Italian, but it's not. In order to avoid associations, because as an adult, you will learn a language easily because you can associate. But once you cannot any longer, you have to rely on the techniques that you use. So by doing this, I was able to prove that by performing gestures, you acquire more, and you forget it, and you don't forget it for a long time. And if you just look at the bars, I should not turn, so you might see the numbers. So the first time these participants in this experiment heard 36 words, and heard and read them, but 18 of them were additionally performed by gestures. I first performed the gestures and then they repeated them. And the retention, so how many words did they keep in their mind? Day one, 22 to 10%, more or less. I can't read it there. Next day, you will see it's more than double. And then after 2 weeks, there were no repetitions. They just had to retrieve from their, let's say, store. And still, you see the red bar is much, much bigger than the blue bar. And then after 14 weeks, look at the bars. Of course, you also forget the words. If you don't repeat them at all, you also forget them if you have learned them with gestures, but you forget much less. And after 14 months, there was still a test. And in this test, we could show that by learning them with gestures, they retained about 10 times as much. So sure, you forget if you don't repeat any longer, but how much you forget. So and this was the reason why I had to dig further. I could not leave it with that. I had my PhD, but it was a behavioral PhD, so I wanted to really look into the brain and see whether this old idea of having a large network, my idea, it was my intuition, that by making the gestures, the network would grow much bigger and would retain the information much better. So I had to go further. So my hypothesis was, if you make the gesture, you construct from scratch in a language which you don't know, which you have collected no experiences with. You build up from scratch a sensory motor, multisensory network. So by making the gesture, you connect all these components and you construct a strong network which will keep the words in the foreign language for much longer and much better. And one thing I was particularly interested in was the involvement of the motor cortex, so there's a strip. And my idea is still, if you involve the motor cortex, you will get a much, much better retention over time. So let's have a look what the scanning did. I had to move to Germany for a few years, and I did a postdoc at the Max Planck Institute for Human Brain Sciences in Leipzig. It was the most terrific time of my life under different aspects. and there you might recognize this. This is the institute. This was my office. Here I lived. And these are the scanners. And and I went there to test this hypothesis. So my boss, Angela Friederici, I think in those days, #1 worldwide. It was a huge privilege to work with her. She said, yes, but if you add whichever motor information, you might learn as well, as good as you, if you make monkey or if you make funny things. So by just rubbing your hands, it could be as good as making the monkey, right? So that would be good for schools or so, because they would not have to think of gestures and so on. So we ran an experiment, first behaviorally, with two kinds of gestures. Semantically unrelated, so rub your hands, scratch your head, lift your foot or whatever. And the other kind of gestures which were iconic, so house, rabbit, swim, so gestures that represent the meaning. And as you can see with the bars, the iconic gestures are, of course, the yellow bar. So if you make a gesture that represents what you're saying, the retention is much better. So you see, all over the time, you learn better if you make a gesture that shows the meaning, of course. And the other gestures did help a bit, but not as much. And in the long term, after 60 days, the test shows you keep in mind better if the gesture is meaningful. And then in the brain, what did I find in the brain? It would take too long to show you all the details, which are really, really fascinating. But just one detail I want to show to you. You see the yellow spots in the brain on your right side? This is the motor cortex, which becomes active after the persons have studied the words with iconic gestures. So you do have this motor component I was looking for. So that was the confirmation that I was not that wrong as many people would have thought. And yes, and then in the end, I could show that if you perform a gesture, you construct a very stable brain network consisting of all the components you have added into the audio-visual information. So I just want to navigate you through this. This is the auditory cortex. In the scanner, my subjects only listened and read the words. They didn't move. You cannot move in the functional magnetic resonance scanner. So they heard the words, but here, this is speaking a word. They could reconstruct that they had spoken the words when learning them. And also, very interestingly, here, visual areas. This is not reading. Reading is here. So you see the little spot is for reading. This is for all the input they had got when they looked at me, when they looked at themselves while performing the gestures. And most importantly, look at this fantastic motor cortex. This is what I wanted to show. And altogether, these complex networks made the memory performance so good and so long-lasting. So with the words of Klimesh, complex networks with many components, among which, I say, a motor trace store information in a more complex way and decay less fast. And this is why gestures help you to learn vocabulary faster and better. And I hope I have convinced you and that next time you learn a language, you probably might perform yourself gestures as well, even if your teacher doesn't want to do this. So you might say, I've heard the talk, the TEDx talk at Linz University, and I've been told about that, so I do it. Keep in mind, the more you include, the better you will be able to speak. I went boldly because this was new. Nobody was really interested in innovation, but I did not surrender. So this is the reason why I'm here today, and I really want to thank you for your attention. Thank you.